There is a version of the story of William and Harry that is usually told very simply. Two brothers grew up in the same palace. One was the heir, one was the spare. They were close as boys, bonded by loss, separated by duty, and eventually destroyed by jealousy, marriage, press pressure, and old resentment. But there is another way to look at it, a quieter way, a colder way. What if one of the biggest breaks between them did not begin with Meghan, or the tabloids, or the interviews, or the book, or the walk behind the coffin, or any of the moments we have all watched over and over again? What if it began much earlier, with one sentence behind palace walls? Harry can go, William cannot. That is the story that is now resurfaced through a former royal aide. William, according to this account, was not allowed to follow his younger brother into Afghanistan. Officially, the reason was simple. He was second in line to the throne. He was too important to risk. The monarchy could not gamble with the life of a future king in a war zone. And from the outside, that sounds reasonable. Of course it does. A future monarch is not just a private citizen. William was not only a young officer, he was an institution in human form. His body belonged to a family, a government, a line of succession, 1,000 years of ceremony and survival. If something happened to him in Afghanistan, it would not have been treated as one soldier's tragedy. It would have been a national event. So the decision made sense. But the thing about decisions that make sense is that they can still break people. Because for William and Harry, this was never just about deployment. It was never only about military logistics or royal security. It was about what each brother was allowed to become. Harry was allowed to go to war. William was required to stay safe. And that difference may have done more damage than anyone wanted to admit. To understand why, you have to forget the headlines for a moment. Forget the Netflix series, forget the memoir, forget the balcony appearances, the frost in public, the carefully arranged seating plans, the briefings, the counter-briefings, the royal experts speaking in serious voices about who looked at whom for how many seconds. Go back to two young men in uniform. Both trained, both wanted to serve. Both were born into a family that wrapped patriotism, duty, sacrifice, and military service into its public identity. Both understood that wearing the uniform was not supposed to be costume, it was supposed to mean something. And then the system looked at them and said, one of you may risk your life, the other may not. That is the kind of difference that does not need to be shouted to become painful. It just sits there. It follows you into every conversation. It follows you into every newspaper article. It follows you into every family gathering where one brother has stories he can never fully explain and the other has questions he may never feel allowed to ask. Harry went to Afghanistan twice. The first time, his deployment was cut short after his location became public. The second time, he served as an Apache helicopter co-pilot gunner. He experienced the danger, the adrenaline, the pressure, and the strange brotherhood that comes from being far away from the palace, far away from polished shoes and gold braid, inside a world where rank and bloodline do not protect you in the same way. That matters. Because for Harry, Afghanistan was not just a battlefield. It was an exit door. For years he had been the younger son, the one with no throne waiting at the end of the road. He was famous before he could understand fame. He was photographed before he could consent to being watched. His mistakes were treated as national entertainment. His grief was public property. His role was defined before he had a chance to define himself. And then, in the army, he could be something else. Not Prince Harry, the troubled spare. Not Diana's younger boy. Not the red-haired royal who filled column inches. A soldier. A person with a job that had nothing to do with waving from balconies. That is why his service mattered so deeply to him. It gave him a kind of identity the palace had never really given him. In Afghanistan, he could tell himself that he was not decorative. He was not extra. He was not just the brother born after the important one. He had a purpose that could not be reduced to birth order. And that is where the story becomes complicated. Because while Harry found purpose by being sent into danger, William was being protected from it. Not because he was weak, not because he lacked courage, not because he did not want to serve, but because he was William. That sounds like privilege, and it was privilege. But privilege can also be a cage when it removes your right to choose the test that would prove something to yourself. Imagine being told your whole life that duty is the highest virtue. Imagine being raised inside a family where military service is part of the mythology. Imagine standing beside your younger brother in uniform, knowing he is being allowed to enter the real theater of war, while you are being told your duty is to remain untouched. The public sees protection. The person inside it may feel humiliation, because there is a strange cruelty in being preserved for the future. Everyone tells you it is an honor. Everyone tells you it is necessary. Everyone tells you it proves how valuable you are. But what if all you hear is this? Your brother gets to be tested. You get to be stored. That is the emotional core of this story. William's life has often been described as the life Harry envied. He was the heir. He had the path. He had the certainty. He had the public respect that comes with being the serious one, the steady one, the future king. Harry, meanwhile, had to fight the old royal problem of the second son: visibility without true power, fame without a defined ending. But Afghanistan flips the picture. For once, Harry was the one allowed into reality. William was the one left behind, inside the glass. And if you are interested in the royal family not as gossip, but as a machine that shapes real human beings, this is the kind of detail worth paying attention to, because it shows that the monarchy did not simply give William more than Harry. It also took something from him. It took away risk. It took away the right to be ordinary. It took away the chance to stand beside his brother in the one place where titles mattered less than performance. That does not make William more wounded than Harry. It makes the wound different. Harry's wound was exposure. William's wound may have been containment. Harry was sent into danger and came back changed by what he had seen. William was kept away from danger and may have been changed by what he was not allowed to see. And between brothers, that difference can be poisonous. Not instantly, not dramatically, not in one argument where someone says the wrong thing and everything collapses. More often, it happens quietly. One brother comes home with experiences the other cannot access. He has memories, fears, private jokes, losses, flashes of adrenaline, and a new seriousness in the way he understands life and death. The other brother can love him, he can be proud of him, he can support him, but he cannot enter that room. And if the brother who went to war begins to feel that the brother who stayed behind cannot understand him, resentment grows. If the brother who stayed behind begins to feel that the brother who went to war now has a kind of authenticity he was denied, resentment grows there too. Two resentments, moving in opposite directions. That is how a bond changes, not because love disappears, because comparison becomes unbearable. For Harry, Afghanistan may have sharpened the feeling that he had lived something raw and real, while William remained inside the protected architecture of monarchy. For William, Harry's service may have represented the one form of royal duty he had been refused precisely because he was the heir. One brother could say, "I served in war." The other could say, "I was not allowed." And those are not equal sentences. One carries proof, the other carries explanation. Proof is louder. Explanation sounds defensive, even when it is true. That is a terrible place for brothers to end up, especially brothers like William and Harry, whose entire public story had been built on the idea that they were a pair. The boys behind Diana's coffin, the young princes who would modernize the monarchy together, the sons who understood each other in a way no outsider could. People wanted to believe they were inseparable because it made the tragedy easier to carry. If Diana was gone, at least the boys had each other. If the monarchy was cold, at least the brothers were warm. If the institution took so much from them, at least it gave them a bond nobody could break. But maybe that was always too simple. Maybe the same institution that made the bond so necessary also placed a fracture line through it from the beginning. Heir, spare, future king, backup, protected asset, expendable symbol. Those words are brutal, but the system works through them even when nobody says them out loud. And Afghanistan made that hierarchy visible in a way that could not be smoothed over. Because this was not about who got the bigger bedroom, or who received more attention from courtiers, or who had the heavier schedule. This was life and death. This was the ultimate test of whether the two brothers really had the same freedom. They did not. Harry could be risked, William could not. And there is a dark meaning inside that. On the surface, it says William was more valuable to the crown. Underneath, it says Harry was more available for danger. That is not a small message for a younger son to absorb. If you are Harry, you might hear, "They can afford to lose me." If you are William, you might hear, "I do not belong to myself." Both messages hurt, and the tragedy is that each brother might have looked at the other and seen only the advantage. Harry may have looked at William and seen the protected heir, the man whose path was guaranteed, whose importance was unquestioned, whose future was written into the constitution of the country. William may have looked at Harry and seen freedom, action, authenticity, a chance to step outside the gilded script and become real in the eyes of soldiers, veterans, and perhaps himself. Each one saw the other side of the cage. Neither could fully live there. This is why the Afghanistan detail is so powerful. It does not need scandal. It does not need shouting. It does not need secret recordings or leaked texts. It cuts deeper because it belongs to the old architecture of their lives. The monarchy did not have to choose to divide them in a dramatic way. It only had to follow its own logic. Protect the heir. Use the spare. And once you see it that way, so many later moments begin to look different. Harry's anger at the institution does not appear from nowhere. William's loyalty to the institution becomes more complicated. Harry's insistence that he found meaning among soldiers sounds less like a royal hobby and more like a lifeline. William's controlled, careful public image sounds less like natural coldness and more like a man who has been trained to treat restraint as survival. This is not about turning one brother into the villain and the other into the victim. That is too easy, and honestly, it misses the point. The point is that both men were shaped by the same machine in opposite ways. Harry was given the dangerous freedom of being second. William was given the suffocating importance of being first. And Afghanistan may have been the moment when that stopped being theoretical. Before that, heir and spare could still sound like palace language. Cruel, yes, but abstract. A role, a joke. A family shorthand. Something that mattered in ceremonies and newspaper profiles, but not necessarily in the emotional life between two brothers. War made it real. Because when deployment came, birth order decided who could go. Think about how that would feel in private. Harry leaves, William stays. Harry enters a world of heat, dust, fear, helicopters, orders, comrades, danger, and consequences. William remains within a world of royal protection, public expectation, scheduled appearances, carefully managed service, and the knowledge that he is being kept alive for a role he did not choose. Harry returns with stories that cannot be translated into palace language. William listens from the other side of an experience he was barred from having. And somewhere in that silence, something changes. Maybe not visibly, maybe not at once. Maybe they still laughed together, worked together, appeared together, supported military causes together. The public version could continue for years. Brothers can keep performing closeness long after private understanding has begun to thin. But the distance would be there. Because Harry had crossed a threshold William could not cross, and William had remained behind a threshold Harry could never truly understand. This is where the old royal story becomes almost Shakespearean, not because everyone is making grand speeches in candlelit rooms, but because the roles are bigger than the people trapped inside them. William and Harry did not invent the hierarchy, they inherited it. They did not design the emotional math of heir and spare, they were born into it before they could speak. But once they became adults, they had to live with what that math did to them. And Afghanistan may have been one of the sharpest equations of all. One brother was permitted to risk death in order to feel useful. The other was denied that risk because his usefulness depended on staying alive. That is the cruelest part. For Harry, danger became proof of value. For William, safety became proof of captivity. So when people ask why their relationship collapsed, it may be too small to answer with one wedding, one interview, one argument, one book, one woman, one briefing, one icy look at a funeral. Those things matter, of course they matter, but they are surface eruptions. The deeper pressure was building for years, and it may have built in places the public never thought to look. A military posting, a denied deployment, a younger brother stepping into war, an older brother being told, in effect, that the kingdom could not survive his courage. If that sounds dramatic, it is because monarchy is dramatic by design. It turns private family tensions into questions of national continuity. It takes normal sibling rivalry and gives it crowns, uniforms, medals, palaces, and constitutional meaning. In an ordinary family, one brother's career path can create jealousy. In this family, one brother's deployment could become a symbol of who was free, who was trapped, who mattered, and who could be risked. That is why this story matters. It offers a way to understand the brothers without reducing them. Harry was not simply reckless. William was not simply privileged. Harry was not simply the wounded one. William was not simply the cold one. They were two sons of the same house, given two different versions of duty, and then expected to remain emotionally fluent in each other's lives. But how do you stay close to someone whose deepest proof of manhood is an experience you were forbidden to share? How do you stay close to someone whose protection reminds you that you were always considered more disposable? That is the question sitting underneath the Afghanistan story, and once that question is in the room, the brotherhood looks different. Because Harry's time in Afghanistan did not only give him trauma, pride, and credibility, it gave him a private world. A world of soldiers, veterans, loss, dark humor, pressure, and memory. A world where he could be judged by what he did rather than what he was born as. William had his own military life, his own service, his own seriousness, but he did not have that same combat experience. He did not have the same break from royal insulation. He did not have the same claim to having stood where Harry stood. And in a relationship already shaped by unequal roles, that difference could become enormous. It is easy to imagine the public seeing Harry's deployments as a royal success story. The prince who served, the prince who wanted the front line, the prince who seemed happier among soldiers than at palace events, the prince who found, in the armed forces, a kind of belonging that later became central to his identity. But inside the family, every success story has a shadow. Harry's authenticity could make William's restraint look artificial. William's destiny could make Harry's service look like compensation. And neither interpretation would be fully fair. That is how brothers hurt each other without intending to. They become symbols in each other's minds. Not whole people, but living reminders. William becomes the crown. Harry becomes escape. William becomes the future. Harry becomes freedom. William becomes control. Harry becomes danger. William becomes the protected one. Harry becomes the one they could send. And once a brother becomes a symbol, it becomes harder to love him simply. You start reacting not only to what he says, but to everything he represents. So when Harry later speaks about service, about trauma, about the army saving him, about veterans understanding him in ways the palace did not, William may hear something beyond the words. He may hear a claim to reality he cannot match. And when William speaks about duty, continuity, responsibility, and the institution, Harry may hear something beyond the words too. He may hear the voice of the system that decided one son had to be preserved and the other could be exposed. This is why the Afghanistan divide is not a footnote, it is a lens. It lets us see the brothers not as two celebrities feuding across continents, but as two men who were separated by the very duties that were supposed to bind them. And the most painful part is this. Neither of them had a clean way to talk about it. Harry could not easily complain that he was allowed to serve in a war he wanted to join. That would sound strange, even ungrateful, to people who see deployment only as danger. William could not easily complain that he was kept safe because he was too important. That would sound even stranger, maybe spoiled, maybe absurd, to people outside the palace. So the wound had no simple language. It could only come out sideways, in irritation, in distance, in competitiveness, in coldness, in the gradual loss of that old ease between them. And when a wound has no language, it tends to become character. People stop saying, he is hurt. They start saying, he is angry. They stop saying, he was denied something. They start saying, he is jealous. They stop saying, he was used by the system. They start saying, he is bitter. That may have happened to both of them. Harry's anger became a public identity. William's restraint became a public identity. And somewhere beneath both identities were two young officers standing on opposite sides of a decision they did not make. One went. One stayed. And neither came out unchanged. But to understand what that really did to them, we have to look at the crown itself. Because in this story, the crown is not a background object. It is not just the family business. It is the third presence between the brothers, the silent force that kept deciding what each son was allowed to be. And once you see the crown as the third brother in the room, the story becomes much darker. The crown is often spoken about as if it is a symbol, a golden object on a cushion, a ceremony, a promise. A beautiful abstraction that connects one generation to the next. But inside a family, the crown is not abstract. It chooses. It chooses who must be protected. It chooses who may be exposed. It chooses who gets a future written in advance and who is expected to find meaning in the spaces around it. It chooses which son is too valuable to lose, and which son can be sent close enough to danger to prove that the family still understands sacrifice. That is why Afghanistan matters so much in the story of William and Harry, because it shows the crown doing what it always does. It does not ask what would make the brothers equal. It asks what will preserve the institution. And the answer was clear. William must remain safe. Harry can go. Now, there is a way to say that kindly. There is a way to say it with all the official language of security assessments, succession planning, military advice, and operational risk. No one needed to be cruel. No one needed to sit William down and say, "Your life is not yours." No one needed to tell Harry, "You are more expendable." The system did not have to say it. The decision said it for them. And in families, decisions speak very loudly. This is what makes the royal version of brotherhood so strange. Most brothers grow up comparing themselves in small ways. Who got more attention? Who was better at school? Who was funnier? Who was braver? Who got away with more? Who disappointed the parents? Who made them proud? But William and Harry grew up comparing themselves inside a global institution. Their differences were not private. They were photographed. Their grief was photographed. Their uniforms were photographed. Their relationships were photographed. Even their closeness became a public asset, something the monarchy could use to look warmer, younger, more human. The brothers were not only brothers, they were reassurance. After Diana's death, the image of William and Harry together became emotionally important to millions of people. They represented survival. They represented continuity after catastrophe. They represented the hope that, whatever the royal family had failed to give Diana, her sons would at least have each other. That public hope must have been heavy, because the world wanted them to be a pair, while the monarchy was training them to become opposites. William was trained to absorb pressure. Harry was trained to live around it. William was prepared to inherit. Harry was expected to support. William's future narrowed as he grew older. Harry's future remained vague, which looked like freedom from the outside, but could feel like emptiness from within. And then came the army. For Harry, the army gave structure to that emptiness. It gave him a place where the question was not, "What are you for in the royal family?" The question was, "Can you do the job? Can you be useful here? Can you hold yourself together? Can you be trusted by the people next to you?" That kind of question can be liberating. It is brutal, but it is clear. And Harry has spoken many times about how much the military world meant to him. It was not just service, it was identity. It was belonging. It was one of the few places where the noise around his life seemed to quiet down. That is why his time in Afghanistan became so central to the man he later presented to the world. The Invictus Games did not come from nowhere. His advocacy for wounded veterans did not come from nowhere. His language about trauma, recovery, and invisible wounds did not come from nowhere. Afghanistan gave him something the palace never could: a mission that felt personal, a community that felt earned, and a story about himself that did not begin and end with being second born. If this kind of story pulls you in, it is probably because royal history is never only about crowns and castles. It is about what those crowns and castles do to real people. So if you are following along, stay with this angle because it changes the way the entire William and Harry story feels. For William, the military path was different. He trained, he served, he worked as a search and rescue pilot and later as an air ambulance pilot. Those roles mattered. They were serious. They involved skill, discipline, danger, and responsibility. It would be wrong to erase that. But the point is not that William did nothing. The point is that he was not allowed to do what Harry did. And that distinction matters, because for two brothers raised in the same household, The difference between choosing not to go and being told you cannot go is enormous. If William had chosen a safer role entirely on his own, the story would feel different. If he had never wanted combat deployment, there would be less emotional weight. But the claim from this former royal aide is not that William lacked interest. It is that the decision was made for him because he was the heir. That means the denial was not personal failure. It was institutional possession. You belong to the crown, so the crown decides how much danger you may face. And when the crown makes that decision, it does something subtle to masculinity, to brotherhood, to pride. It turns protection into limitation. It turns importance into powerlessness. It turns the future king into someone who cannot fully act like other men his age because his life has already been mortgaged to the future. That is the hidden pain in William's position. He was not only privileged, he was claimed. He could not simply be brave. His bravery had to be managed. He could not simply take risks. His risks had to be acceptable to the institution. He could not simply stand beside Harry in Afghanistan because the meaning of his body was different. Harry's body belonged to Harry, at least more than William's did. William's body belonged to succession. That is a strange thing to say about a human being. But monarchy makes strange things normal, and if you listen carefully, this is where the sadness deepens, because the same decision that may have made Harry feel less essential also may have made William feel less free. Harry might have carried the message, "They can risk me." William might have carried the message, "They own me." And both brothers could be right. How do you repair that? How do you sit across from your brother after that and speak honestly without sounding resentful? If Harry says, "I went to war and you stayed protected," it sounds like accusation. If William says, "I wanted to go and they would not let me," it sounds like excuse. If Harry says, "The army made me who I am," William may hear, "You never had that test." If William says, "My duty was different," Harry may hear, "The same old hierarchy again." The conversation becomes almost impossible. So instead of saying the truth, brothers often say safer things. They joke. They avoid. They compete. They put the tension somewhere else. They let years pass. And by the time the real conflict comes, everyone thinks the conflict is about the latest event, because that is the event they can see. But the older wound is still there. This is why the later fracture between William and Harry has always felt larger than any single explanation. Yes, the press mattered. Yes, marriage mattered. Yes, palace staff mattered. Yes, Harry's exit mattered. Yes, the memoir and interviews mattered. But those moments landed on ground that had already been cracked. Afghanistan did not have to be the whole cause. It only had to be one of the moments when the brothers learned that their lives would never be comparable again. Before Afghanistan, they could still imagine themselves as partners in the same strange life. Different roles, yes, but still brothers walking through the same storm. After Afghanistan, Harry had crossed into an experience that William could admire but not share. William had been held back by a responsibility Harry could resent, but not truly understand. That is the beginning of emotional exile. Not physical distance, emotional distance. The kind where two people can stand next to each other at a public event and still feel separated by an entire landscape. Harry had the landscape of war behind him. William had the architecture of monarchy around him. And neither landscape was easy to explain to the other. One of the most painful things about adult siblings is that childhood closeness does not automatically survive adult destiny. You can share the same parents, the same rooms, the same jokes, the same grief, and still become strangers because life gives each of you a different language. Harry's language became trauma, service, escape, therapy, truth-telling, and survival outside the palace. William's language became duty, restraint, continuity, privacy, and survival inside the palace. Afghanistan helped shape those languages. For Harry, it confirmed that meaning could exist away from the royal family. He could be valued outside the palace structure. He could build loyalty with people who did not care about him because he was royal, or at least not only because he was royal. That must have been intoxicating for someone who had spent his whole life being looked at through the lens of birth. For William, the denial confirmed the opposite. His life could not truly separate from the institution. Even his military ambitions had a ceiling. Even his courage had conditions. Even his service had to bend around the fact that one day he would be king. That is not just a career difference. That is a spiritual difference. And it may explain why their later choices looked so incompatible. Harry eventually chose separation from the working royal system. William moved deeper into it. Harry began to speak as someone who had to leave in order to live. William continued to embody the idea that staying is the duty. If you trace that back through Afghanistan, the pattern becomes sharper. Harry had already experienced a form of meaningful life outside palace control. William had already experienced the impossibility of escaping palace control. So when Harry later said, in effect, "I cannot live like this anymore," perhaps William did not only hear a brother in pain. Perhaps he heard the old fantasy he was never allowed to pursue. Leaving, choosing, being only yourself. And perhaps when William looked at Harry leaving, he did not just see betrayal. He saw something he could never do. That is a dangerous emotional cocktail. A brother who leaves can look brave. A brother who stays can look trapped. But the brother who stays may also believe he is the only one carrying the weight. He may think, "You gotta go to war, you gotta leave the institution, you gotta tell your story, and I am still here, still holding the line, still turning my private pain into public silence." Meanwhile, the brother who leaves may think, "You were protected, you were believed, you were prepared for power, and I had to fight for every identity I ever had." Both stories contain truth. That is what makes the conflict so hard to flatten. It is not good brother versus bad brother. It is two men speaking from two wounds that do not recognize each other. The public often wants a simpler drama. It wants one brother to be cold and one brother to be emotional. Or one brother to be loyal and one brother to be destructive. Or one brother to be jealous and one brother to be arrogant. Simplicity is satisfying because it gives the viewer a place to stand. But this story does not really offer that. It offers something sadder. The possibility that William and Harry hurt each other most because they each represent the life the other was denied. Harry represents the freedom William could not have. William represents the security Harry never fully felt. Harry represents experience beyond the palace. William represents belonging within it. Harry represents danger chosen. William represents duty imposed. And Afghanistan made all of that visible. Even if they never said it that way, especially if they never said it that way. Because families are full of truths that are never said directly. They move through tone, silence, timing, expression. They are there in what gets celebrated too loudly and what gets ignored too quickly. They are there in the look on a face when one person receives praise for something another person wanted to do but was never permitted to attempt. Imagine Harry being praised for bravery. He deserved praise. Now imagine William hearing that praise. He may have felt proud. He may have felt relieved his brother came home. He may have admired him deeply. All of that can be true. And still, somewhere underneath, there may have been a sting. Not because Harry had done anything wrong, because William had been denied the comparison. That is what denied experience does. It haunts you with a question that cannot be answered. What would I have been if they had let me go? Would I have been brave? Would I have been changed? Would my brother have seen me differently? Would I have seen myself differently? Would the public have understood me in another way? Would I have felt less like a symbol and more like a man? Those questions do not disappear because a palace says the decision was practical. And for Harry, the questions would have been different, but just as painful. Why was I allowed to go when William was not? Was it because they trusted me? Was it because they needed me to have a role? Or was it because losing me would have been survivable in a way losing him would not? That is a devastating question for the spare. Even if nobody means it cruelly, the hierarchy says it constantly. The heir must be preserved. The spare can absorb risk. This is the old logic of monarchy, dressed in modern uniforms. And if you are Harry, maybe you try to transform that logic into pride. You say, "I served. I chose it. I was useful. I was not just spare. I was someone my fellow soldiers could count on." That transformation is powerful, but it may also carry a shadow, because the very place that gave Harry dignity also reminded him of his disposability. Again, both things can be true. War gave him identity. The monarchy gave him the permission to seek it there because he was not the heir. That is the kind of contradiction that can live inside a person for years. And when Harry later spoke publicly about his pain, many people heard only complaint. They asked how someone born into such privilege could speak of suffering. But privilege does not cancel emotional injury. It often disguises it, which makes the injury harder to name. The same is true for William. People see the future king and assume certainty must feel good. But certainty can be a prison when you are born into it. Everyone knows what you will become before you know who you are. Every personal desire must be negotiated against a role older than your own life. That does not make William powerless in every way, but it does mean that his power came with a lifelong surrender, and Afghanistan may have been one of the moments when that surrender became painfully concrete. You cannot go. Not because you are afraid, not because you are unqualified, because you are the heir, because the institution needs your future more than it needs your choice. That sentence has consequences. And maybe one of those consequences was the slow erosion of equality between the brothers. Not equality of rank. They never had that. Equality of emotional footing. The feeling that, beneath the titles, they could still meet as two men who understood each other. Afghanistan may have made that harder. Harry came back carrying things William could not carry. William stayed behind carrying things Harry could not carry. And instead of drawing them closer, the difference may have made each brother feel unseen by the only person who was supposed to understand. That is the real tragedy. Not that they were different. All siblings are different. The tragedy is that their differences were arranged by a system that then expected them to behave as if nothing had been taken. The crown protected William and exposed Harry, then needed both of them to smile together. The crown gave William destiny and Harry uncertainty, then needed both of them to act like a team. The crown made one brother central and one brother secondary, then sold the world the image of two equal sons of Diana walking forward together. That image was beautiful. It may also have been impossible. And when an impossible image finally breaks, people are shocked because they mistook the image for the relationship. They saw the brothers laughing in public and assumed the bond was simple. They saw them support military charities and assumed the shared cause erased the private distance. They saw them grow into men and assumed childhood grief had made them permanently loyal to each other. But grief does not always unite people forever. Sometimes it bonds them when they are young, then separates them when they begin to survive it differently. Harry survived by seeking spaces where he could be more than royal. William survived by becoming more royal. Harry's war service fit one path. William's denied combat path fit the other. And that is why the former aide's claim feels like more than a detail. It gives language to a divide many people sensed but could not quite explain. It suggests that long before the public feud, long before California, long before the documentaries and statements and carefully worded palace responses, the brothers had already been split by a decision that told each of them something different about his value. One was valuable because he had to be preserved. One was valuable because he could be sent. Which message would you rather carry? There is no painless answer. If you carry William's message, you may feel trapped by importance. If you carry Harry's message, you may feel wounded by replaceability. This is why the story has such lasting power. It is not dependent on today's headlines. It does not need a new appearance or a new quote or a new palace leak to matter. It touches something older and more universal, the pain of siblings being assigned roles and then blamed for becoming the people those roles created. In ordinary families, those roles might be the responsible one and the difficult one, the successful one and the sensitive one, the favorite and the problem, the one who stays and the one who leaves. In the royal family, the roles are heir and spare. But the emotional pattern is recognizable. One child becomes the future, the other becomes the contrast, and both pay. So perhaps Afghanistan did not create the William and Harry rupture. Perhaps it revealed it. It revealed that Harry could find honor in a place William was barred from entering. It revealed that William's position, so enviable from the outside, could deny him the very experience that might have made him feel equal to his brother. It revealed that the crown did not raise two boys into two free men. It raised them into two functions: future king, supporting prince. And when those functions collided with real human longing, something had to give. The sadness is that, for a long time, they seemed to try to outrun it. They stood together. They worked together. They shared causes. They let the public believe the old story because maybe part of them wanted to believe it too. Maybe they wanted to believe that brotherhood could be stronger than hierarchy. Maybe they wanted to believe Diana's sons could build something warmer than the institution around them. Maybe they wanted to believe that the army, charity work, marriage, adulthood, and fatherhood would give them new ways to understand each other. But history has weight, and in royal life, history is not behind you. It is in the room, every day, deciding where you sit, what you wear, what you can say, where you can go, how close you can stand to danger, and whether your courage belongs to you. For William, the lesson was duty before desire. For Harry, the lesson was desire as survival. That difference is enormous, and Afghanistan may have been one of the first places where it became impossible to ignore. So when you hear that William was never allowed to follow Harry into Afghanistan, do not hear it only as a security decision. Hear it as a sentence in the long, emotional biography of two brothers. Harry went to war and came back with proof that he could be more than the spare. William stayed behind and was reminded that he could never be less than the heir. One was changed by danger. The other was changed by being denied it. And after that, maybe they could still love each other. Maybe they could still laugh. Maybe they could still work side by side. But some invisible equality had been damaged, because there are experiences that do not simply add to a life. They divided into before and after. For Harry, Afghanistan was one of those experiences. For William, not being allowed to go may have been one too. And that is the part people miss. Absence can shape a person as much as presence. The war Harry saw changed him. The war William did not get to see may have changed him too. Different wounds, same family, same crown, different cages. If there is one reason this story still matters, it is that it forces us to stop asking only why Harry left or why William stayed. It asks us to look earlier, at the machinery that made leaving and staying feel like their only possible endings. Harry had already learned that meaning could be found outside the palace. William had already learned that his meaning was chained to it. Harry's path eventually led him away. William's path pulled him deeper in. And between those two paths stood all the things they could never fully say to each other. You were allowed. I was forbidden. You were protected. I was risked. You escaped. I remained. You got to be real. I had to be royal. Those are not official quotes. They are the emotional truths this story suggests. The unsaid lines beneath years of public silence and private strain. And maybe that is why the William and Harry story refuses to fade. It is not only about two famous brothers falling out. It is about what happens when a family turns children into roles, then expects love to survive the assignment. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it survives for a while. And sometimes, much later, people look back and realize the fracture was not born in the moment everything became public. It began in the quiet decisions, the practical decisions, the decisions everyone could defend, the decisions that made perfect sense to the institution and terrible sense to the heart. Harry can go. William cannot. 7 words, perhaps, that carried more emotional weight than anyone understood at the time. Because from that moment, the brothers were no longer simply walking different royal paths. One had gone into the war, the other had been kept for the throne. And neither position was as simple as it looked.